So welcome and hi everyone, and thanks for coming to our lecture 2 in our series of lectures on COP27. At our first lecture, we heard from academics, policymakers, and representatives from the private sector on the developing carbon market. And today, we'll be switching tracks to hear from civil society instead, and their expectations for key issues that will be negotiated at COP27, taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh starting next week. So before we get into the discussions today, I would like to thank the sponsors for this series, which is co-organized by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, One RHT Foundation, RHT Green, and Verse. So first up, we'll be hearing from our first speaker, Sandeep. Sandeep Chamling Rai is the Senior Advisor on Global Climate Adaptation Policy of WWF Global Climate and Energy Practice, and he is based in Singapore. He leads WWF's work on climate change adaptation and has almost 2 decades of working experience on climate change adaptation and loss and damage both at the national and international levels. He has been actively participating in the United Nations climate change negotiation process since 2003, and he leads WWF's policy and advocacy work on adaptation and loss and damage. So we'll be hearing more from him on these issues. So Sandeep, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Firstly, thank you, Audrey. And firstly, thank you so much for NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solution for inviting me and on this lecture series. So like Audrey said, I will be really focusing on 3 key aspects of today's. Firstly, on adaptation, second on loss and damage, and thirdly on the nature and what are the various agenda items and what's our expectation from a civil society perspective. So I will focus on, I would say, 3 key topics. Firstly, on the adaptation agenda under the UNFCCC of COP27, second on loss and damage, and third on nature elements. So I'll go into detail into those elements, and my colleague Swati will go on other aspect. So in terms of the adaptation key agenda item for COP27, if you look, the adaptation agenda item is split into 5 key components. Firstly, on the COP27, where it's basically talking about the reports on the adaptation committee. There is whole the sub-agenda item on the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on global goal on adaptation, which is quite a new topic that was been decided since last COP. And third, under the SBI agenda item, we are focusing on the NAPS, the National Adaptation Plan, the Adaptation Fund, and its board, its review. And under the CMA, this Conference of the Parties having the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. That on CMA agenda item is on the Adaptation Committee, review of the Adaptation Committee and the Glasgow program, and under the CMP is on the Adaptation Fund board and its review. So it's quite scattered. So I'm just trying to highlight that adaptation as such is one topic, but is under the different agenda item is very broad and very comprehensive. So these are all the negotiating, I would say, agenda item that we'll discuss at the COP under the name of adaptation. But I will not go into all this detail. I'll just highlight few that is really relevant and important, and depending upon the time and also where we are right now. The first one is definitely the global goal on adaptation. The global goal on adaptation, let me say about this progress on the global goal on adaptation. So global goal on adaptation was part of the Paris Agreement Article 7.1, which really talks about enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and the reducing vulnerability. So that was part of the Paris Agreement, which really talked about 3 key pillars of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. But so far, the global goal on adaptation has not been operationalized. And if you look at what was the decision at the Glasgow COP or at the COP26, the party decided a 2-year, I would say, work program. What they call is Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal. And this work program is under the Substine SBI agenda item. This is joint agenda item under the Substine SBI, which really organized 4 workshops in 1 year and do annual reporting. So far, all the 3 workshops has been completed. The last workshop was last week in Cairo, and the last workshop the fourth workshop will take place in 5th of November in Samalsek. So end of next week. So in terms of what's our expectation from the glass work program or from the entirely the global GGA, the global goal on adaptation is the glass work program should establish a transparent and common understanding how to escalate local, sectoral, national action and how to assess the collective progress of achieving the global goal that has been agreed in the Paris Agreement. That's the first expectation. Second expectation is basically the glass program must identify the adaptation gaps, especially the gaps in both developing countries and the action needed to support the vulnerable countries' need to escalate the adaptation action. That's the second ask. The third, in terms of this agenda item, what we are asking is the glass work program must clarify how it fits into the global structured process, which is currently happening and go and run up to end of 2023, and how it will be used as a source of input for the NCQZ. So NCQZ is a new acronym that was, I think, decided last year. It stands new collective quantifying goal on climate finance. So that will be decided by the end of 2024. So that is, and how that glass work can really fit into the new NCQZ discussion as well. And the last thing what we really expect from the COP27 on this agenda item is the GGA, the Global Goal on Adaptation, should be a permanent agenda item under the CMA and the SB. And because the glass work program will be finished by COP28, so the GGA will take over after that. And that's one of our key expectations. So I will not go into detail. The detail you can see the resources and other things I have put in the slide where we had made a couple of submissions and also the report that you can go through it. The second agenda item, which is quite heavily debated and discussed, will be adaptation finance. So just to give you in terms of background, the scale of adaptation finance is small compared to what is really needed. So far, only, let's say, 4 to 8% of climate finance is going on adaptation as per the IPCC 6 assessment report that was released in early this March. But despite the increasing in adaptation finance, there is a lot of, I would say the adaptation cost in developing country is not really meeting the needs of what is required. For example, there are some estimates saying that around $70 billion of adaptation finance is needed on a yearly basis, but it will really grow in a rapid way of at least 140 to 300 billion per year by 2030 and around 500 billion per year by 2050. That was done by the UNEP, but we have to keep in mind that this financial figure is based on 1.5 degree temperature scenario. And as the temperature increases, the cost of adaptation need will increase, but in some cases the adaptation limits will exceed, so that we will not be able to adapt with the climate disaster. And there is a whole issue of accessing the climate finance is one of the key aspects, and also the quality of adaptation finance is also one of the key. When we talk about quality is whether it's in the grant or it's in the loan. So those elements are there. But what we have seen is at COP26, there was 3 key decisions that was really good for adaptation action. The firstly, there was around close to $1 billion US placed for adaptation support. That was really good. And there was also a decision that urged developed country to at least double their adaptation finance contribution by 2025 with the baseline of 2019 level. So that was really good decision. And the third, one of the critical decision was 5% share of proceeds from the Article 6.4 mechanism, which is the market mechanism under the Paris Agreement, will go to the adaptation fund. So this is one of the key, I would say, it's a good decision or milestone decision for generating adaptation funding for adaptation fund. So as a WWF or as a civil society, what we really want from this COP27 on adaptation finance is parties really need to escalate towards doubling the adaptation finance with a clear roadmap, because the roadmap of doubling the adaptation finance was not really decided at the COP26. So that needs to be decided at this particular COP with an accounting mechanism of how the developed country will meet their commitment of doubling their adaptation finance by 2025 as per the Glasgow Climate Pact. So that's one key aspect. Second aspect is we also really want to improve understanding of adaptation finance, access the need and gap through the glass program, and that also inform for the NCQZ discussion or new qualitative quantified goal discussion on the climate finance. And thirdly, we really want to see the scale of adaptation finance this year, but also to have at least 50% of the public climate finance is going for the adaptation in developing country. If you look the Paris Agreement and also the consequence, the follow-up decision, they say the finance by adaptation and mitigation needs to be balanced. But the balance is very vague term. We need to really define that as a civil society and as a larger the environmental group, we say, can the climate action network, we are calling for at least 50% because that really gives in terms of part to the mitigation finance. And a third component, the third critical component I want to talk is the National Adaptation Plan, then the NAPS. Well, just to give highlight, the NAPS or the National Adaptation Plan, which was established in the year 2021, is year 2021 in Cancun, really helps the developing country to identify their mid and long-term adaptation needs. So the NAPS was basically in year 2021, and we are in year 2011, and we are in year 2022, almost 11 years down the road. Only around close to 40 countries have submitted their national adaptation plan to UNFCCC. So, but at COP26, and last year in Glasgow, there was decision that the SPI will initiate a assessment of progress of formulating and implementing NAPS and to make a recommendation by the COP29 in terms of how to take that forward. So this is also one of the I would say good decision, but not in the way that we really like. So at this particular COP, we really want a decision on this particular agenda item is we encourage all developing countries to prepare their NAPS as soon as possible in advance to global stocktake process, which is taken from this year all the way to 2023, and start immediately those adaptation priority as highlighted in the NAPS. But having said that, many countries are already in the final stage of preparing the NAPS, and the implementation part is one big question mark. So we also really urge the developed country to provide the financial support in the form of grant within easy access for the urgent preparation and implementation of the National Adaptation Plan. So that's the second expectation what we really want to see on this agenda item. And there are many others topics that we really need to see in the name of adaptation within this UNFCCC COP27 process. The first one is global stocktake or GST. The second, I already mentioned the NCQZ, new collective quantifying goal. The third is on the nature-based solution and how it's really forming. The fourth is ocean dialogue. That's also one of the critical, I would say, discussion that is happening. The fifth one is this joint work program on agriculture and food system. And the sixth one is the non-state actor on adaptation, especially the restore resilience, which is outside the UNFCCC, but within the climate, I would say, package. And seventh one is any kind of adaptation related announcement. We also really want to follow and see what is happening outside or outside the negotiation process, to be precise. And in terms of some of the political acts, because the technical acts is for the technical negotiator, but from the political acts, when we are talking with the key politicians or at a minister level, we are really talking about three key things for COP27 to deliver. Firstly, a roadmap on doubling the adaptation of finance as per the Glasgow Climate Pact, and at least 50% of public climate finance goes for adaptation as a grant finance. The second element is defining the key element and framing of the global goal on adaptation with a clear midterm milestone on the Glasgow program that needs to be delivered at COP27, and establishing clear linkages of adaptation with the GST process or the global stocktake process and the adaptation finance goal in the new collective quantifying goal. So these are the three key arcs that we really want to see at the political level. Now, let me move to the loss and damage part. That was the adaptation very briefly. And moving to the loss and damage, firstly, let's talk about what is loss and damage. So far in the negotiation, there is no agreed definition of loss and damage, but what we can really quantify is the impacts of climate change due to insufficient effect to reduce greenhouse gas emission, and inadequate adaptation action is considered as a loss and damage. So if there's insufficient mitigation action and inadequate adaptation support, then the losses and damages happen. So that's one of the definition. And basically there are two types of loss and damage. One is economic losses. Economic losses are those losses that you can quantify in a monetary term. For example, loss of infrastructure, loss of property like houses and buildings, and loss of agriculture production and those kind of things, which can be quantified. But there are also non-economic losses, for example, loss of life, loss of health and mobility, loss of territory and cultural heritage, or even loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. These are the non-economic losses. But I have to be honest, in the UNFCCC process, and especially in the discussion of loss and damage, most of the time the discussion is focused on the economic loss, because non-economic loss is really hard to quantify. But there are some cases where the non-economic loss is also really coming forward. And if you look at the COP27 agenda item, loss and damage are within the COP agenda item, the SOFTA SBI and the CMA agenda item. But I really want to stress two things. Firstly, if you look about the current, I would say the provisional agenda item, matter related to funding arrangement for loss and damage is the new agenda item under the COP and the CMA, item number 8F, this one, if you can see my mouse. This is the heavily discussed topic right now, and this is just a provisional agenda item. And there was article yesterday only that even the EU is somehow now agreeing on this agenda item. Now, detail of what will be discussed within that is yet to be defined, but I'm sure that the COP president is really trying to bring this matter much more strongly. And this agenda item was somehow agreed at the head of delegation level meeting, I think 1 month ago, and it was also quite heavily discussed during the pre-COP before. So this will be one of the key, I would say, topic at this particular COP. And we can be safe to say the outcome on loss and damage will really judge the outcome of the COP27. And so that's very highly politicized and highly sensitive topic at this point. Now, I will talk very briefly in terms of the loss and damage finance, which is heavily discussed, will be discussed at the COP. Just to give background, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was agreed in 2013. And it has 5 functions, and out of the 5 functions, the action and support is the 5th function of the Warsaw International Mechanism. But when we talk about action and support, there is no funding yet in the UNFCCC process. So to address that at COP26, with a strong pressure from the developing country, the COP decided to establish a Glasgow dialogue, and Glasgow dialogue will held every year during the SP session, that is in June normally, and will be finalized by June 2024. And there was no decision on the loss and damage facility at Glasgow. And so this will be one of the big and heavily discussed topic at COP27, and it is now as a part of the provisional agenda item at this COP. Now, as in civil society, I will say our expectation on this agenda item is this COP27 must establish a loss and damage finance facility under the UNFCCC financial mechanism, which are dedicated funds. And for that, and loss and damage finance goal needs to be a key element of new collective quantified goal in addition to mitigation and adaptation finance. So that's what our expectation is. And second component that will be heavily discussed at this COP will be Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. Just to give very brief background, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage is a technical body under the Warsaw International Mechanism. And at COP26, there was a decision that funding for technical assistance will be provided. And there was call for submission, the technical workshop and SB during the SBs is in terms of how to operationalize the Santiago Network. And at this particular COP, the governance of the Santiago Network and the governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism will be decided. And so far, there are around 20 million euros committed for this network. But as in civil society, we really want to have a fully operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage with dedicated funding and capacity needs, and to effectively implement this function is one of our key asks. Now, other topic, like there are many other topics that we need to really look into loss and damage. Firstly, the institutional element of the awards international mechanism will be key, and how the GST process take into account of loss and damage, and how the NCQZ discussion will be discussed with the loss and damage keeping in the mind or not, how the nature-based solution will be discussed, the ocean dialogue, as well as some of the announcement on the loss and damage finding. For example, Denmark, I think last month only they announced $13 million to address loss and damage in developing country. But this is some of the announcement that is outside the UNFCCC process, and there is also a whole German with the Germany as a G7 presidency also announced the Global Shield initiative to address climate risk. That is also a kind of addressing loss and damage aspect. So those announcements are also critical to look what's happening outside. And in terms of the political acts, when we talk with key ministers and others, we want three key things at the COP27. Firstly, establishing loss and damage facility with a new and additional sources of finance. Second is fully operationalization of the Santiago network as a technical facility and dedicated fund and capacity to effectively implement this function. And thirdly, the loss and damage finance goal in the new NCQZ discussion. So those were the loss and damage part. Now I will very briefly go to the nature-based solution at COP27. But before going into a little bit detail, I just want to highlight that nature-based solution, or I will say nature element, is not new in the negotiation. But if you look from the adaptation point of view, ecosystem-based adaptation is always there since for a long time. But as such, nature was not there. So if you look at COP25 decision, there were two, I would say, critical, component. And then firstly, on the one CP25 decision, para 15, which really talks about underlying the contribution of nature to address climate change and its impact, and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in the integrated manner. So this is the first time in the UNFCCC that the nature was part of the COP decision text. And then there was also a call for a standing committee on finance to look to the financing the nature-based solution initiative. But at COP26, further, I would say, rebuilding on the decision of 1 CP25, and at 1 CP26, it really talks about recognizing the interlinked global crisis of climate change and the biodiversity loss with a critical role of protection, conserving and the restoring nature and ecosystem in a delivering benefit for climate adaptation and mitigation. So which is really good in terms of much more building from what has been highlighted in the 1 CP25 or COP26. And also under the 1 CMA3 in the para 38 also really further emphasize the role of the nature and the biodiversity protection into the climate space. But just to put this upfront, that there is no agreed definition of nature-based solution in the UNFCCC process. And so now there are some of the challenges, especially on how to put nature or nature-based solution within the UNFCCC. Firstly, there is a lot of momentum that is going outside the UNFCCC process on nature or nature-based solution quite strongly, but not the internal, because nature-based solution varies. The understanding of nature-based solution varies from individual to individual, and this is a very contentious topic in the UNFCCC process. And if you had followed the IPCC discussion, it was South Africa and some of our Latin American countries were really opposed against the word of nature-based solution. So, and that's also reflected in the UNFCCC negotiation. So that's we need to really understand that. And nature doesn't seem to be a key issue for the negotiation, and most likely not even in the near future. That's my own assessment. I will be happy to be wrong, but in the UNFCCC, that doesn't really focus on the thematic basis of at the negotiation level. It could be outside, like what we see in the ocean dialogue and others, but not within the UNFCCC space. So those are some of these challenges that we can see, though there's a lot of momentum that is happening outside, but there's a limited work that is in the inside process, because inside process, They are discussing mitigation, adaptation, finance, the technology transfers, and others. Is on very comprehensive basis, but doesn't follow on the sectoral specific. But having said that, what we really want to political prioritize is some of the key aspects. First one is follow up the COP25 and COP26 decision in terms of further acknowledgement of nature, a role of nature at 1.5 degree and building climate resilience. The second is, if possible, we really want to check out a cover decision on nature-based solution at the COP, and also nature to be considered in the all process of the convention. And fourth one is, based on the IPCC AR6 recommendation, we really want to see the language of protection of 30 to 50% of the critical ecosystem worldwide, and for the climate resilience development. And we also really want to see the nature and the NBS is really integrated into the climate plans like NDC, long-term strategies and national adaptation plan, and also guidance on how nature-based solution can be a part of the global structured process that happens every 5 years or so, starting from year 2023, and a clear roadmap on the annual ocean dialogue. And most importantly, and what we as a WWF are also really seeing that the success of the COP15 on the CBD will also determine by the success of how nature will be integrated into the climate discussion at this particular COP in COP27, because CBD will happen after this COP. So we really want to pave a way and create a political momentum of the nature-based solution at this particular COP, and that really fits into the successful COP of the CBD at Montreal for COP15. So that's all from my side, and you can see our expectation paper in the link, and I will be happy to take Q&A later on. And thank you so much, and thanks. That's all from my side, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, for that presentation. Now we'll have our second speaker, Swati, to come up and share more from her perspective. Swati is an Assistant Market Transformation Manager at WWF-Singapore, where she manages the Green Group's climate engagement program that helps companies in Singapore decarbonize. Swati works with companies on platforms such as the SBTi, which aligns corporate emissions with the Paris Agreement on climate change. She previously worked as a sustainability business analyst at Blue Planet Environmental Solutions and as a writer for ecobusiness.com. So Swati, please come up. Thank you.
All right. Hello, hi, everyone. So nice to be here and to speak about COP27. So just as Audrey mentioned, I work with WWF Singapore, and Sandeep is part of the international team, while I look on more local issues and talking about decarbonization in the context of Singapore. Sorry, let me just, yeah. So for today, what I had prepared was to talk a little bit more about the COP27 process, but from the lens of the non-party stakeholders. So what Sandeep mentioned, given the expectations specifically around adaptation and loss and damages, those are expectations that WWF as a civil society has, and what they are a non-party stakeholder. I will go into that a little bit, but before that, I have two slides just, kind of pulling focus into what is happening in the world, which is influencing the decision-making around COP. So number one, really important, is COP is happening in Africa this year. After 5 years of a Europe-centric COP, we're finally moving out. It was supposed to be in Chile, but there was an unfortunate, I think there was a coup, but it moved to Spain. So now we have, outside of Europe, where we have a much more highlighted interest in food security, and given the geopolitical reality of where we are, we also have much more significant interest in energy security, but from a bilateral and multilateral lens. We also have the UN Biodiversity Conference, which I think Sandeep briefly mentioned, where we are looking at, how are not just countries, but also companies bringing nature into the decision-making and the biodiversity loss that we are seeing, how can some of that be combated? So this being the background of what COP we are expecting to see at that conference and the result of all of these global sort of movements. Specifically from the climate context, I mean, us in Singapore are already feeling it. I think May was the hottest temperature ever recorded in Singapore, but we also see in countries like Germany and Australia, we've seen unprecedented extreme weather events or temperatures or even events of loss of productivity, which have not existed before. So we have a very set climate context where I think the cost of climate change is coming into the public and political consciousness. We obviously have and the energy crisis, and we see countries rolling back some of the climate commitments. Only yesterday, the UN released, the UNFCCC released the NDC synthesis report, NDC being the nationally determined contributions, which is every country's target. And that has put us at this point at a 2.5 degree trajectory. I mean, which is better than the 3.4, which was, I think, 4 years ago, but it still is not good enough. 1.5 is really the target that we're looking at. So what most civil societies, including WWF, the focus that they have at this conference from the negotiators, from those decision makers in the room, is we need a convergence of the climate and nature agenda. We cannot afford to treat it in silos, and that's what a lot of environmental NGOs and other social NGOs are also quite keen to see. Second is we've gone through the age of finalizing the mechanisms. We've gone through Katowice and through Madrid, where we were operationalizing the Paris Agreement. At this point, it is really time to take the action on it, and that's what countries are non-party stakeholders are really looking forward to. And lastly, of course, is the on-ground implementation of all of what has been decided, including the carbon markets or the transference of CDMs to the Article 6 and all those nuances within those discussed mechanisms. I thought this was quite interesting. So as we see that NDCs or national plans are coming in, we are also seeing that countries understand they will not be able to do it in isolation, and they have a massive financial requirement. So as Sandeep mentioned previously, loss and damage is a significant part of tackling climate change. This is to motivate countries to reduce GHG emissions and have the mitigation measures. So if you see here, the mitigation needs expressed in national, so these are called conditionals in the NDC, which is they're willing to achieve that if X amount of finance is directed towards their markets or the country. And so as we see, the mitigation is mostly on the energy transition, and that's what countries are requiring finance for to make a stronger business case for example, energy decarbonization. On the adaptation aspect, we are seeing a much more, a deeper focus on agriculture and water. Both resources, both extremely important to the market economy, and both under massive threats from climate change. So seeing this, as you can see, so the Asia Pacific states have about 3.1 to 3.2 trillion USD dollars of demands of financing to enable both the mitigation and adaptation transition. African states in comparison have 2.5 trillion approximately. So this is a massive funding gap that is, that exists right now in the various NDCs that are put forward by countries. Now, just to talk a little bit about COP itself and also about what we expect and where we are as civil society. So these are spheres of influence. These are layered structures of how the processes work. So in the middle sits the negotiation space. So I think, as Sandeep as well mentioned, COP, CMA, SB, and SABSTA are bodies under the UNFCCC convention that are delivering on different streams. And they're really the negotiation space. This is where, Brazil is talking to India, is talking to Sweden. This is where that is happening. And then right outside it are these bodies that the UNFCCC has assigned to direct where the conversation is going. For example, you see the COP presidency. This year, Egypt obviously is the COP president. Next year is going to be Middle East. I think UAE is going to be the president next year. Previous year was UK. These precedents are really important to set the tone, and that's why the civil society is very concerned about how these precedents are chosen and what kind of political or social or environmental background they come from. And then going a little bit farther, which is where much of the influence from civil society comes in, is blue zone is really the negotiation zone, and green zone is where a lot of the events with the local communities, interactions, and regional issues are brought up. And that's where civil society exists. This is a very strong platform for a lot of organizations to talk about some of the key aspects that they are struggling with in their local economies or in the region where the COP is being held. Sorry, I will expedite. Yes, so non-party stakeholders, again, extremely critical to the process. And as you can see, They are observer states. So these are witnesses, these are watchdogs, these are people who are looking over the negotiation process to understand whether those deliverables, the broader agenda is being met or not. So again, so when we look at the spheres of influence, we have a lot of different variations of where climate issues are discussed and at what level. So the UNFC triple negotiation space, you really talk about some of the key issues, including loss and damage in finance that Sandeep explored earlier. But then you have the platform issues. So for example, this is called the food COP, because thematically, Africa is a center for food security and where food is a critical issue. So this COP will also have a massive amount of conversation around those key platforms. Then you have high-level engagement, so you have CEOs and head of states meeting, creating understandings and bilaterals. And then lastly, you have the international groups that are kind of bringing this all together, tying in the narrative and leveraging, advocating for their agendas. The UN itself also recognizes this. So we have this process called, this platform called the Action for Climate Empowerment under the Article 6 of the Convention and Article 12, because there is a recognition that, any major climate decision cannot be done in isolation. It needs a stakeholder buy-in beyond just the state. And what it requires is to be inclusive, and what inclusivity results is in a diversity of views that is really difficult to bring together. But here is where the resilience for any program will come in. So there's 6 aspects of the ACE committee, which is education, public awareness, training, public participation, access to information, and cooperation. And this is where a lot of NGOs, civil society really have to play a part in the negotiation process to give their inputs on these aspects, which will become critical part of the climate movement. A massive collective of environmental NGOs is called the Climate Action Network International. I just wanted to demonstrate here that they brought together 200 different environmental NGOs from around the world, including WWF being one of them, to create this public statement. And this is what they take to an event like COP. They take this consensus from a large amount of NGOs. They take the collective sort of consensus that we do need to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and that becomes the basis of their advocacy that they promote. So whether they're talking about Article 6 as in carbon markets, or they're talking about transparency or frameworks, the underlying ideal is what gets us closer to the 1.5 degree goal. And that's how different NGOs come together as a collective to these platforms. Given that I work specifically on the market side, I thought, I know Sandeep already alluded to some of the other expectations for COP, but for us, from a climate and energy perspective, we have 4 major asks as an NGO to negotiators. Number 1 is we have to deliver on the energy transition. We are at a point where we can go really, we can find this opportunity to remove our dependency on fossil fuels, or we can go back to our dependency on those conventional fuels to survive a tough winter. I'm not commenting on what pathway immediately is right, but the point is that there has to be a scaling up of the renewable energy systems, and also a focus on efficiency, which is quite often underlooked, and that's one of the key aspects we're looking forward to, and phasing out fossil fuels as it is not compatible with the 2050 net zero scenario. Second is to reduce the worsening impacts of climate change. This is where loss and damage and adaptation is really important. So not only are we looking at mitigation, but how are we managing the impacts that we're already seeing, and how can we reduce some of the crisis for the people most vulnerable on the margins. Third is mobilizing finance. As I mentioned right at the start, the expectation for finance is massive. We are looking at trillions. And at this point, we haven't even been able to deliver on the $100 billion climate finance annual commitment that developed countries made. And this is quite shocking. And it'll be interesting to see this year, given the energy crisis and given what Europe and US is also going through, whether they will actually be able to deliver on this. One of the failures, I would say, of Glasgow was not being able to mobilize on finance at all, or not the expected level, and advance the goal on financing. And lastly, of course, is to strengthen civil society participation. Again, last year, unfortunately, we had moments of exclusion because of a lot of reasons, including COVID-19. But given that, this is a different country, this is going to be a different set of policymakers and political agendas being discussed, there's an expectation that civil society participation might not be as robust as it could have been or has been in the past. So one of the key concerns and expectations is not only to fulfill what previously was committed, but also strengthening further that participation of the civil society. This is just to give an overview of how many different practices come together to actually contribute to COP, because there's something for fresh water when you look at hydropower, or when you look at when you also look at food systems. There is forest, wildlife, and oceans as well. Huge participation, of course, food as well. And then the cross-cutting factors such as markets, finance, and governance. So for civil society, some are focused on specific issues, but like WWF, we have functionalities in different aspects of the natural ecosystem that we advocate for. And just want to give a glimpse of how many different individuals with different expertise actually participate and work together to create a uniform position across the board. This is just an example to again show what level of diversity exists in the topics that we have at COP. These are the days by the presidency that have been selected. So you can say they're focusing on finance, youth, adaptation, biodiversity, energy. And so this is really, I mean, if you do follow COP from here, you will know the thematic days and be able to follow some of the key conversations around that. Lastly, briefly, if I'm running out of time, let me know, but I will just want to focus on the youth aspect and how important youth are at COP. I just share a personal anecdote. I attended COP the first time back in 2018 as part of the youth delegation. It was in Katowice. It was extremely cold, and it was Poland, so it was a very foreign country. But one of the most interesting things was being part of the youth NGO. It was so surprising to come together with individuals from around the world, have the same ideas of our collective future. And that's what it really represents at COP. The civil society participation and the individuals who come there because of despite a lot of challenges, and have come there because they're really motivated to showcase their voices. And that's what makes it quite powerful. And so for the negotiators there, for the scientists there, for the media there, participation of these groups are extremely important, because they do push the kind of barriers down a little bit for participation. So this is just how the plenary looks, and this was a letter to the negotiators about the 1.5 degree target at Glasgow. It was just found on the floor, but it's just, there's a lot of advocacy around 1.5 done by the youth NGOs, and I think that's been quite an important message so far. I just want to share, this is advocacy we've done in Singapore. I think we have some of the members in the audience here as well. And this has been quite an interesting one. I mean, you can already see how big the delegation is from Katowice to Glasgow. But this has been quite an interesting change, even in Singapore government, to have much more inclusion of voices as we are going towards the whole net zero transition and the green transition of the economy. And what is really interesting here to see is that the opportunity to engage with negotiators, to talk to them, and to express expectations from other youths. So Singapore youths collectively have a position that they shared just before the COP Glasgow. And this is an opportunity, I think, which is quite interesting. And this is where civil society and non-party stakeholders become a critical part of COP to accelerate the key messages and to push the envelope on decarbonization at a platform like this. All right, I think that's it from me. Back to you, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Swati, for the presentation. So now we have come to the Q&A segment. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please just head on to the microphones at the side to ask your questions. But while waiting for you guys to think of what you want to ask our panelists today, I'll just give you guys a brief introduction to myself. My name is Audrey, and I'm the Science Communication and Outreach Lead at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. And I'll be your moderator for the panel today. So maybe we'll just kickstart the panel with you, Swati. Thanks for your presentation. I mean, it's quite a different perspective that we are getting at this lecture. I mean, in the first lecture, we heard from the private sector, we heard from members of the Singapore government. So it's interesting to see how civil society is gearing up for COP27. But maybe just give us an inkling of why this collaboration is so important. Have you seen any positive outcomes that come out from this collaboration?
Yes. Well, I feel the presence of civil society has been sort of explained through the presentation, but it's very interesting to ask what has that actually resulted in so far and what have we seen? I would say a lot of it is, a process. So it's not just that because civil society participated, this happened. A lot of things, sequences happen. What is important and what is the underlying critical role is there's a constant voice reminding you to achieve certain goals that were set out. And I think that's what the role of civil society has been. I think there was a movement last year at Glasgow where WWF-International had like elephant signs and says, we do not forget. Because the point is that there has to be watchdogs and individuals in the audience who are paying attention and guiding policymakers where it is required. So one is kind of having that collective memory, sustaining that memory and holding people accountable to that. I think that has been a critical role of civil society. Not necessarily confrontation, although that has been the pathway for certain. I will not comment whether this is right or wrong, but it has been. But there's also been a much more collaborative perspective to it. So I think one of the main benefits has been, for example, keeping 1.5 degree alive, having a lot of gender and education and youth issues brought front. This has been a product of civil participation rather than purely political intention, I would say. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you think, Singapore's recent announcements, the government has recently announced that we're going to set 2050 as our net zero year and we're going to kind of improve our 2030 targets. I think we still need clarity on that. But would you say that that has been also the result of civil society, keeping tabs on Singapore's nationally determined contributions?
Do I want to believe this? Yes. But the truth is probably everything more complicated than that. I think what has been quite interesting is that we were very clearly communicated to as civil society that we need ground up support. Back in maybe 5 years ago, where civil society started participating. The point was, we need more support. It's isolated voices. I think that has fundamentally changed. Alongside that, the mechanization of Article 6, a massive investment in green economy, the carbon market movement, all of those probably contributed. But I think what has changed from the civil society perspective is there's a much more public consciousness before. So there's a confidence, maybe, I would like to believe, in the policymakers to make a complicated thing like, 2050, interim target, long-term target, have a consultation on it. So I don't think a lack of civil society would have completely not made it possible, but I think it helped kind of grease the wheels, is my perception.
Watchdog, I like that term. But it seems like we have a question from a member of the audience. Maybe you can introduce yourself and let us know which panelists you'd like to direct your question to.
Sure. Hi, I'm Liang Lei, a journalist at Eco-Business. Thanks for the presentations. Yeah, my question is more on the negotiations for finance this round at COP27. So there's a lot of asks for money from developing countries to developed countries on different topics. For example, on adaptation, in loss and damage, there's calls for money for actual climate disasters as they happen. And also, of course, in terms of mitigation in the conditional NDCs. Just wondering, given that developed countries, they are hesitant on committing further funding as we've seen in past years, how should parties navigate this negotiation? Is there a way to kind of prioritize these asks for different things to get the best results this time? Thank you.
Thanks, Liang Lei. Sandeep, I think this is right up your alley. Would you like to comment?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think that's a very, I would say, prominent question at this particular COP. But what I really want to highlight is that though the climate negotiation is I would say is formed from the climate justice point of view, and that's the one point that civil society has been raising, the voice of the climate justice and the voice of the science and what the science is really telling. And in terms of climate finance, yeah, definitely really developed country will hesitate in terms of giving money what has been asked, but it's not about only what has been asked, but also developed countries had not fulfilled their commitment what they had already committed. I'm just giving an example. In Copenhagen in 2009, and they already agreed to mobilize at least $100 billion annually by 2020, let's say by 2020. That has not been really done yet. So, but as Swati also highlighted, we need trillions of dollars, right? Is billions of dollars is not will be a drop in the ocean. But having said that, we also need to find out the different way in terms of generating the money. We know that there will be a limited, I would say, public finance, but we really need to diversify in terms of what are some of the new innovative sources of finance that we can generate those money. And those some of the ideas that are really putting forward by civil society is, let's say, for example, taxation on the fossil fuel company or those kind of things. So there are other avenue where those can be those areas can be discussed, but there needs to be a willingness from a developed country point of view, especially based on the historical responsibilities, because developed countries emission is the main, I would say, culprit for all the climate disaster, and their emissions are still high. But having said that, some of the developing countries' emissions are also rapidly increasing. So, but based on the historical responsibility and also respective capabilities, those are the principles in the climate negotiation. So, and we need to really find a way in terms of generating those resources, because it's not the matter of let's say how much or when, is a matter of now. And there is no, I would say, prioritization in the UNFCCC process in which money goes to where. But for if you ask me, I personally believe, it's not a WWF position also, I personally believe that most of the public finance needs to go for adaptation and dealing with loss and damage. Because for the private finance can really mobilize for the mitigation action, because mitigation is where you can really generate revenue. So my feeling is that most of the public finance can go for the adaptation part, and the private finance can really leverage for the mitigation aspect. So, so some of my points. Over.
Thank you. Am I allowed to ask a second question?
Sure.
Okay.
Go for it.
Sorry, just one more question on nature-based solutions, because based on Sandeep, based on what you listed earlier on the negotiation points for NBS, there don't seem to be any actionable agenda items to be discussed at COP27. Just wondering what you think should be added to the agenda in terms of really actionable things to drive meaningful action on NBS, for example. Do we need better carbon markets, or better funding, or better definitions for what is NBS? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a very good question, and many people are really calling for nature-based solution. But to be very, I would say, to be very fair, nature-based solution is not part of the formal agenda item in the COP negotiation space, like what is there for mitigation and adaptation. Because in the negotiation doesn't happen on the sectoral basis. If you open the floor for the nature-based solution, then tomorrow I think some other issue will come. So there is no, because the negotiations happen on mitigation, adaptation, finance, technological transfers, and the carbon market under the Article 6, those kind of elements. A nature-based solution is the approach that helps to meet both mitigation and adaptation benefit, and is a cross-cutting. So the nature-based solution cannot be in a formal agenda item in a near-term future. That's my personal, I would say, estimation. I may be completely wrong, or I may be happy to be wrong, but that's how doesn't really negotiation happens. And there is no, I would say, common understanding of nature-based solution. Even within today, even among us, I think there are different interpretations of nature-based solution. So that's one point. But nature-based solution doesn't have to be its own agenda item. It's already embedded in some other elements. For example, there's a whole discussion on ocean dialogue that is happening not in the formal negotiation, a little bit outside, but that is linked. That is where the nature-based solution plays a role. And even in the carbon market, I think, and most of the, I would say, business are really looking for the nature-based solution is from the generating the revenue. So those carbon market is already there. For example, in Bali in 2007, the whole rate mechanism, reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, was already agreed in Bali in 2007. So now we are just say rate into nature-based solution for carbon market is just changes in terminology. So in terms of the nature-based solution as a topic on the agenda item under the SOFTA and SPI or even COP and CMA, it is not there, and most likely it may not be there for some more years until and unless any country want to really put that into agenda. But there is a process which is a little bit outside of the negotiation process where those topics are quite heavily discussed, and the market mechanism will, especially when you're talking about the carbon trading from a forestry sector and others, that is the nature-based solution for mitigation aspects. So it's somehow over there. So those who might take.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Actually, I have a follow-up question for that. Maybe, Swati, you can take this instead. So while nature-based solutions will not be officially on the COP agenda, do you foresee that nature would take a greater role in the discussion of the other areas? I mean, this is especially at COP26, there was this Glasgow Leaders Declaration on land use and deforestation, right? Do you think that would come up again at this year's COP?
Maybe Sandeep can add to it for sure, because I think we have slightly different perspectives. Because looking from like the corporate sector and the markets perspective, given that there is the conference in Canada, which is COP15, which is for the CBD, and also the CITES one in Panama for illegal trafficking and of threatened species. I think in general, the consciousness around biodiversity is growing, and while it shouldn't be siloed, UNFCCC is a more climate-focused one rather than more entangled with it. But one of the key expectations of WWF as well is that if you have an emphasis at the climate change, at the UNFCCC conferences on nature, it accelerates its importance of CBD and of those elements of it as well. And ultimately, the goal would be to interlink these conventions to kind of feed into each other. So while at COP, it might, for example, nature-based solutions might not be on the agenda, it is still very important that those aspects are brought up at every point possible, so that there is a linkage and there's a sort of spillover effect where other conferences discussing this can see it as important as well. So I would say definitely that's important, especially for Southeast Asia. I think it's extremely important that biodiversity becomes part of the conversation and not so isolated at this point.
And at the center, we have lots of research going on at this intersection between biodiversity and climate. But Sandeep, do you want to chime in on anything, maybe on the role of nature and adaptation?
No, yeah, sure. I would say, firstly, building on what Swati has said, firstly, we need to understand why the UNFCCC Convention has been established. The UNFCCC Convention has been established to basically deal with mitigation and to address the climate impacts, right? And so dealing with the let's say reducing greenhouse gas emission, definitely nature can play a role, but nature is a secondary part. And if you look even the IPCC report, though nature can really sequestrate 30% of the global emission, but the same report also says that if we exceed 1.5 degree temperature target, the sink or the sink will be the source of greenhouse gas emission. So we need to understand that I would say dilemma as well. So that's a dilemma what we are dealing with. But having said that, the nature-based solution as a terminology is not in the negotiation process, but the ecosystem-based adaptation is there since the beginning of the UNFCCC Convention. If you are just changing the, I would say, terminology, and if you're saying, let's say, for adaptation, ecosystem-based is a nature-based solution, then it is there since the beginning of the adaptation, I would say, discussion in the process. And if you look about the Nairobi work program, NWP Nairobi work program really deals with the ecosystem-based adaptation approach. And even the ecosystem is also there in the loss and damage discussion, where we talk about the non-economic losses, which also look into aspect of ecosystem and ecosystem services. So on that angle, nature is already there embedded. But if you really want to see the word, what we say in the terminology, the nature-based solution, those terminology not there, and they may not likely to be had that terminology as a nature-based solution because it has different interpretation into this space. So that's the point. So I would say is yes in the formal COP process, but in a different form. I would say the different terminology. But in the outside the main core negotiation space, there is a lot of all these, I would say, that is happening either in the carbon market space or either with the political declaration. For example, France as a country was saying they will allocate 30% of their financing going for nature-based solution. So those aspects are already there in terms of the outside space, but in the inside, still is not there because there is no agreed definition of nature-based solution in the climate space. But it's not only the nature-based solution, there is no any, I would say, agreed definition on climate finance also. So that is how it is a little bit, I would say, complicated because it's basically the South Africa and some of the Latin America and Bolivia and others, they really don't want to see the term nature-based solution in the climate negotiation space because it has different interpretation for them. And for them, they don't really want, let's say, they say the Mother Earth to be traded in the carbon market. So, but there are some, I would say, discussion ongoing, especially not from the pricing the carbon, but more as a voluntary contribution to save nature, not from the quantifying the tons of carbon dioxide, I would say, and making the value of the 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent to, let's say, $20. Those discussions are still there, but there are also other discussion where they are talking about in terms of voluntary pledges where they give money for sequestering the carbon through nature-based solution, but without quantifying any ton of carbon dioxide. So those discussions are still going, and that will definitely happen. And the nature-based solution, like Swati says, is a CBD space. So there will be more discussion on that topic, but there needs to be a linkage between these two.
Okay, thanks, Sandeep. Right now, I just want to ask any more questions from the floor.
Hi. Thanks, Colin Pin from NUS. Thanks, Sandeep and Swati for the excellent presentations and the very lively discussion. I just want to pick up on one of the last few points that Sandeep was talking about. You mentioned there are some countries that are showing some hesitancy and maybe even opposition to having nature-based solutions be featured more prominently in the discussions or negotiations. And I think you sort of explained or mentioned the reason for that very briefly. Could you elaborate on that a bit more, because that's quite interesting, and I think many of us are also very keen to understand why is there this opposition, and how can we overcome that? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Prof. I think firstly, there are a couple of, I would say, reasons based on my assessment and why they are hesitating. Maybe Swati has her own view. Firstly, really, when the nature-based solution comes into really picture much more strongly, there is a strong fear that they are not really, I would say, they are not really reducing the emission, the root cause. For example, reducing the emission from fossil fuel company. And so they really want to see the emission reduction from the primary source as a fossil fuel as an industry. So because that's the main thing. And if the nature-based solution really comes into play, there is also a fear that developed country will just say, okay, we will do more nature-based solution and less on the really reducing the emission. So that is one fear, and which is legit. And it's not only in the, I would say, in the country's level. There are many civil society groups who are really not in the favor of nature-based solution as a part of the real negotiation. For example, the indigenous group really don't want that because they don't want nature-based solution to be treated as in carbon market. So there is a fear that if the nature-based solution come into this space, then it will be heavily discussed in the carbon market, and they don't really want to let's say put price on their motherland, for example. And that's also a point that many of the let's say Latin American countries, especially the Bolivia, is quite heavily, strongly opposing on that. And that what we had also seen in the IPCC discussion. It may not really seen in the COP because there is no agenda item on this part, But what we had really seen a very lively discussion at the IPCC meeting, especially when I followed the Working Group 2 negotiation. It was South Africa and it was Bolivia who was really against, even I would say, putting the nature-based solution. I think it's not even in the summary for policymaker document, if I'm not wrong, but it is in the underlying chapters, or but not in the policy document of the IPCC Working Group 2 report. So there are some those hesitations. So it's basically, if you put nature-based solution in the main front, the main emission reduction from a fossil fuel, I would say, things may go down, or that topic may be, I would say, overlooked. That's one fear. And second fear, they really don't want nature-based solution to be treated in the carbon market, because they really don't want their, they say, Mother Nature to be priced in terms of monetary value. So these are two things. And it's not only the government, but there are also others, I would say, civil society, like engineers groups and others, who are quite against of this particular, I would say, terminology. So those are my take. Maybe Swati has something to add on that.
Not specifically on national positions around nature-based solutions. I mean, you do hear about indigenous communities, about commodification of natural resources. But what I find interesting is one of the most under-discussed issues in the carbon market space is 6.8, which is non-market mechanisms, which is not leveraging on the financing part and the trading part. How can carbon sinks and carbon resources be enhanced? And so non-market mechanism where you have capacity building, kind of technological transfer and things of that nature. I think that's where countries do expect a lot of benefit to come from when it comes to carbon markets, not purely on the financing mechanism. And while you see more innovative financing and you have blended financing, and you have, for example, World Bank, I think they recently invested in a rhinoceros habitat, and their species count was related to their financial output. And you have all these kind of unique formats of quantification, but I think at the end of it, there is a lot of opportunity to do capacity building and also to get more interest in carbon sinks and resources of like biodiversity without having to market mechanize it. Even if you do need finance for it, there has to be a mechanism to be able to do that. And I think groups like WWF quite strongly believe in it. And for example, some such as Greenpeace, because it's a very public position, they really completely reject carbon markets. And I think their apprehension comes from what Sandeep mentioned as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys. And there was another question from the audience.
Hello, I'm Somika from Temasek Life Science Laboratories, and I'm a plant scientist. My question is regarding the transition of energy. So when we are talking about fossil fuel changing to renewables like hydrogen or solar energy, so if I'm not wrong, Singapore's target is 30%, change of 30% of fossil from rather than getting energy from fossil, we are going for this renewable energy. So does plantation trees fall in this category of renewables? Because you're talking about hydrogen, you're talking about solar, you're talking about wind. But if there are people who are planting forests, and that wood can be used to fuel the energy for your electricity, will it be considered as renewable? Will it be considered under the carbon credit schemes?
Okay.
I think for the 30% target, that was Singapore's target for importing renewable energy from the regional grid. So 30% imported clean energy sources by 2035. At that point, the Energy Market Authority didn't exactly lay out, what are the sources, but they did mention, for example, solar panels, and Singapore, of course, just started importing electricity generated by hydropower dams in Laos. So about plantation, specific to Singapore, I don't think we have clarity whether our government considers plantation oil like a form of renewable energy. But maybe, Swati, you can comment about, the general use of such oil, like, is it controversial?
It's just wood, not even oil, just wood. So because in the electricity, you can just burn the wood and produce electricity. and that carbon is fully utilized. There's no wastage in that carbon. And if we are looking to change from the fossil fuel, then what percentage in Singapore are we talking about? That our current usage is about 90%. So whether we are talking about reducing it to 80%, 70%, or is there a year until which we will reduce, say, 20% by X 2030 or 2040?
Right. So, I mean, this is quite a loaded question. So just let me break it down into one, it's Singapore's target, and one is biofuel, or biomass, what you're talking about, where you burn wood for energy. So first talking about biomass. So if you look at Europe and their renewable energy mix, 60% is biomass, is what you're talking about. So whether it comes from incineration, whether it comes from wood chips, it has a couple of different sources. And they, as a regulator, EU, considers biofuel as renewable. But there is sufficient evidence to say this is really subjective. Where is the forest fuel coming from? How is it certified? Is it truly renewable? Is it coming out of deforested land? Is it encouraging deforestation? So there's a lot of questions when it comes around biofuels. Recently, a controversy I would encourage you to look into is where they had massive import of timber from the US, but it was in immediately deforested lands. So that's where biofuels, what you're talking about, kind of gets complicated. So it goes back to the issue of traceability, similar with carbon markets. So I would say something like that is considered and can be considered a source of renewable energy, and it is in EU. That's definitely a massive example. The problem is the traceability issue. So if Singapore is not keen on it, it would probably root from that. Also, unfortunately, biomass is not a very efficient energy carrier. For example, you have hydrogen, that's a much more efficient energy carrier. Also, hydrogen can be non-renewable. That's just like something that I think is important to keep in our mind in Singapore as hydrogen is becoming more mainstream. Secondly, around Singapore's targets. So the one that comes to my head is the 2050 report, the energy report. And that's where Singapore has committed, not committed, has assessed that it's feasible to be net zero under 3 different scenarios. And within that, there's different scenarios. So there's one is where there's a lot of technology. So maybe small modular reactors, which is nuclear energy, could be part of it. There is one where there is regional grid, that becomes a major part of it. And one where there is, I think, hydrogen.
Yeah, hydrogen. Having studied that report, I don't think there was big mention of bioenergy in that.
No.
However, I know that Gardens by the Bay actually takes horticultural waste over Singapore, and that's burnt on site to generate some of the electricity at Gardens by the Bay. But yeah, I don't see that. Actually, maybe Swati, maybe you can talk about BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture is like you grow a forest and then you cut it down, you burn it, and then you capture the carbon, right? Is that controversial in any way?
I definitely don't want to make a position on this right now. I did not get the clearance from WWF, but my understanding is that any system that is claimed to be closed loop has a potential for certain markets and does not for certain. So for example, as the IPCC report says, not only do we need to increase our forests and carbon sinks, we also simultaneously need to decarbonize, because forest and land agriculture will not be able to compensate for any decarbonization we don't do in the energy sector. So quite often people think, what if it's a closed loop? But is it actually adding to the atmospheric balance? Because right now we need to take out more than we need to add. So even if you have a closed loop system, if you're actively not reducing, especially if you have plants, it's a bit problematic. But really it depends on, alternatively, is there coal there? And then maybe this is a beneficial outcome. But if you have the potential for renewable energy, it's not. So it's quite interesting to see the context of these technologies when applied to an actual thing. So perhaps it is, but biomass is under serious criticism in Europe. There is a lot of allegations around whether that's actually should be considered renewable or not. So it really is, it's a little bit on public perception as well. And it is on, what really is the need for the collective in the region.
Yeah, and not to mention like a forest does not just have carbon capturing benefits, right? There's also like co-benefits, pollination and all. Water quality.
Maybe it's worth looking into. Maybe I don't know if Sandeep has heard of this or knows about it extensively. but not definitely maybe worth looking into.
Yeah. I know Temasek Life Sciences Laboratory is looking a lot into all these areas, right? So next time you come and present.
Thank you.
Okay, actually, I have one more question that I was hoping to discuss, which is adaptation financing. Is going to be huge at COP. Sandeep, in your presentation, you did mention that WWF was hoping to have more financing going specifically into adaptation. Maybe you can talk a bit more about why this is the case. Why does most finances go to mitigation, which is like for renewable energy plants, rather than actually helping a community cope?
Thanks, Audrey. And I think, well, if you look the recent, even the IPCC report, well, I'm just quoting IPCC because that's agreed by all parties. It says around 4 to 8% of the climate finance goes for adaptation, and remaining goes for mitigation. The reason behind it is that because adaptation is so, I would say, locally specific, and it's really hard to quantify in terms of how the certain project is really building resilience of the vulnerable countries. So it's really hard to quantify that. And second, most of the adaptation activities, what we see on the ground is, let's say, there is a gray area between the development projects. But and lastly, many of the, I would say, countries are still trying to understand the vulnerability assessment, or trying to understand what are the adaptation needs, right? And adaptation needs varies a lot from based on different temperature scenario. Like what Swati said, the recent synthesis report of the let's say NDC talks about, though we are little bit reducing our global emission, but still way above the 1.5 degree temperature target. And we have done some assessment before, I didn't really show in my slide, what will be the impacts on 1.5 versus, let's say, 2 degree. And the impact is not only doubling, in some cases, it's extremely high. So what we are really aiming and really hope that this COP will really try to put the adaptation in the center of the discussion together with loss and damage, because what we had seen, the climate impacts is facing worldwide, not only in the developing country, but also in the developed world. And they are also feeling the impacts of climate change. So I hope and believe they will feel the, I would say, issue much more seriously, because that is in their backyard or in the front of their, I would say, house. So most probably at this particular COP, we are really trying to push much more strongly on the adaptation finance, but also noting that it is not sufficient because adaptation has a limit, and we also really need to look into the loss and damage aspect as well. So let's see how the negotiation goes, but we are really trying to see whether there is more finance dedicated for adaptation and loss and damage, because adaptation and loss and damage, you cannot really generate revenue from those kind of activities. Unlike the mitigation one, for example, when you plant a renewable energy, or let's say build a solar power plant, there is a revenue generation activities over there, and it's much more likely that the private sector can really come in. So the public sector finance really need to go for the adaptation and also addressing the loss and damage.
Thanks, Sandeep. I think that we have a question over there.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kai Kim. I'm a climate and disaster resilience advisor. I actually want to ask a question actually beyond COP27, which is more related to what is the role for civil society next year, taking into account that it's the year where we're supposed to be doing the global stock take. So could you comment on that? Thank you.
It's creating immense amount of pressure. It's bullying, basically. No, but I think it's so for reference, global stock-take is a process of the Paris Agreement where every 3 years of the 5-year cycle, there's a stock-take as to where what the commitments are and how countries progressed on it, and if countries need to update their targets. So for last year in Glasgow, there was already a call for updating targets, but the main global stock take is what happens next year. And I think what is important, so as a civil society, we're already recognizing that the synthesis, the NDC synthesis report that came out yesterday puts us at 2.5 degree trajectory, and that's not good enough. So we have a clear goal that we're about 1 degree off from where we need to be. And so as part of civil society, a key role is to kind of bring that into consciousness to the policymakers to say, you know, there's still quite a lot, especially in countries where there is a massive trade-off, to kind of talk to policymakers, kind of co-create solutions with them and create confidence that the markets will change and that there will be a benefit of being ambitious early in part of this climate transition. I think the second part was, as Sandeep mentioned, you know, right now adaptation is not highlighted as much as it is, but we are starting to see the impacts of climate change much more, and it's only, unfortunately, it's only going to get worse. There was a meme about Europe where it was the hottest summer ever, and they're like, it's going to be the coldest summer for the next 50 years. And that really puts it into perspective, you know, even if it was really hot, it's only going to get worse. So I think it's about bringing that knowledge, that reality to the decision making, whether it can be ground up from the public consciousness or whether it be building pressure on governments or collaborating with private sector to say how they can enhance their own ambition. But I think reports that we create, content we create in terms of validating some of these targets and why they're important, that can be a critical part of it. But really, ultimately, it's about keeping that narrative alive that, you know, 1.5 should be within reach, and we can't let it, you know, just slip away because of complacency or just immediate challenges rather than long-term vision. Yeah.
And I guess civil society can also help to humanize these stories, right? Because I mean, you are active on the ground. WWF has offices all across Southeast Asia, and it's usually the NGOs that bring the plight of the people to public attention, and hopefully that will actually galvanize some action. Because it's not just something far away, right? Like they can actually see the impacts.
To what you say, I think what Sandeep just mentioned, right? Mitigation is always more attractive to private sector, which gets the money. Adaptation is more appealing, but it's completely skewed, like in terms of what gets more attention in the public eye, but what gets more funding. And I think a part of that is also balancing that out to see whether we can kind of equalize the attention rather than just, you know, glorify some sort of loss.
Like mitigation, it benefits the global climate, and you know the developers get to earn money. Whereas for adaptation, I mean, how can you earn money from a seawall, right? Like, and also it's
but you can,
the
in the long term, avoid loss.
Yeah, avoid loss. Yeah. So, any questions? Okay, we're going to wrap up soon. I just have a couple more, but I just wanted to let you know that there's refreshments outside after this. So just bear with us a bit more. So, okay, today's lecture is really about the role of civil society in COP. So, but what about individuals like you and I and everyone in this audience? Why should Singaporeans care about what's happening in these international negotiations?
Should I go first and maybe Sandeep? Or
Sure.
Sandeep, do you want to go first?
Okay, I will give it a try. Firstly, I would say, well, the COP normally happens in November, around November and December, depending upon the location. But I would say engaging only at the COP doesn't really help, because the whole process really starts maybe after the COP is finished, the next COP. For example, after the Glasgow COP was finished, and still the UK is a presidency until the presidency hand over to the Egypt, there is a whole lot of work that is happening behind closed door, where a lot of engagement from all civil society is really going forward. And it is a whole 1 year long process that we really need to understand, not only the COP, because the COP is the final leg of a long journey. So what we always say that. And in that particular role, the civil society definitely had a bigger role. And coming back to, let's say, Singapore, we live in Singapore, where whether we like it or not, Singapore will be impacted by climate change, whether it's coming from its own emission or the emission coming outside Singapore. And it's a matter of time, and also it's only the matter of time. So in that particular note, we need to be really conscious in terms of how the country is really taking its climate targets, not only on the mitigation part, but also on adaptation part. But also in the meantime, we are also cautious in terms of what's happening at the international level and how we can really put pressure as a civil society, and especially as a youth, where we can really the voice of our concern that really impacts to us. And that is really happening worldwide. And just to give example, let's say, for example, with this all invasion of the Ukraine war and the fuel crisis things, a lot of things have been impacted, all this inflation and others. So one small incident taking place and I wouldn't say small, one incident taking place in Europe is really impacting globally. So we are in the global, whether we like it or not, we are in the like a global family where something happens in one corner really impacts at the global supply chain, and that will really have an impacts worldwide. So we need to be really conscious of that particular matter and really try to see how we can really push for the higher, I would say, ambition on the climate target, both on mitigation and adaptation at the national level, but also meantime how we can really influence in the international process and push much more pressure where that is needed, especially from the high polluting countries. So some of my take.
Swati?
Actually, maybe I have after Glasgow, my view of this has changed a little bit more because as you can imagine, during COVID, Glasgow did not, the conference that was planned for 2020 did not happen and was moved to 21. And that because UK had done such I would say like a good job of engaging not just governments, but also banks were there, and you had Mike Carney, you had Jeff Bezos there, you had all these like massive influencers of the global markets coming and talking about, and I think that created at COP an atmosphere of collaboration and of this kind of multi-stakeholder process. But I think there's a line here where you do not want it, as somebody termed it as like a green Davos. That's not what COP is. COP is anchored by a much more actual process. So part of participating is, going to this engagement sessions, learning more, hearing new perspectives, expanding your own horizon. And I think given that Singapore this year has a pavilion at COP, I think that's a really important indicator that there's an interest from the Singapore market, not just the government, to do something. So those are opportunities, but really the core is, as Sandeep mentioned, is to understand the negotiations and to leverage that to accelerate or to promote certain positions based on the community or group you're representing. That's really at the core of it. I don't think everybody needs to be at COP. I don't think COP needs to be a platform where every individual needs to come to express their concern. But I think everybody, in some extent, with the groups they engage with or the private sector work they do, should be conscious of the impact it's creating on the global community in climate change space. So if you're from a major bank, look at your net zero commitments and just understand that and how it contributes to it. And I think there's an indirect relationship to every company, to every country around COP. So you need to be aware of it, but you don't need to maybe actively participate at the process.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that photo that you showed, what the youth delegates put on the conference table, like, we are not going to be there with you, but we are the ones who are going to suffer the consequences. And that's exactly why Singapore needs to be involved, right? We're already seeing the impacts of climate change. So with that, it's time for tea. You can find refreshments right outside, and don't forget to follow all our great research coming out from the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions on all social media platforms. You can find out more about the links between nature and climate. So thank you, everybody.